and welcome to another episode of REDtalks.live. I am your host, Nathan Pierce, and this is your home of ranting engineers and DevOps. And for the third time, can't get rid of this guy, Kin Lane. Say hi, Kin.
Hey there. Happy to be back. I feel like a regular now.
Yeah, I think three's the charm that makes you a regular. Kin has appeared in previous episodes, such as, I'm looking to my notes on the left, API first strategy and how to achieve that in an organization, and also the importance of API contracts. Fantastic episodes. That was episodes 43 and 46 respectively, so do take a look. But today's episode, we're going to talk about a theme that is becoming, it's not new, but it's becoming very popular in this API-centric world that we're being thrust into, and that is the imperative versus declarative.
Yeah.
Is this a really annoying thing that comes up a lot, Ken? How do you feel about that?
Oh, yeah. So, first of all, I guess, what do we mean by imperative versus declarative? So, I mean, in short, an imperative API design is usually very precise and very intuitive and self-instructive that helps a consumer understand what's possible and implement, work with one resource or one capability that API offers. And without a lot of cognitive load, you read the path. It's got a handful of parameters and you understand what it does, and it's pretty self-explanatory. But it can't be complex. That's part of the design pattern. And then, so that's imperative, really helping the consumer understand what's possible. And then the second is declarative. Is imperative can break down when you're trying to do a lot of things and you have to make a lot of different API calls. So you want to add something, then you want to get that, and then like add another object with that property part of it. You have to make an API call, another one. And some developers who understand the system find that cumbersome, and that's a lot of work to have to craft each API call. And they want a declarative interface where they can just declare a larger scope and say, just add this object and then grab the ID and add these other sub objects. And they can do it without making a lot of different API calls. And in F5 world, we have our classic big IP, I control REST, which is very imperative, a couple thousand API paths. And so if you want to orchestrate your system, you're making 10, 20, 30 API calls. But then we also have an extension, a plugin called AS3, that you can craft this really big JSON object that describes your application or mini application surface area. And you can just say submit, and it'll configure and do all of it. So that's imperative versus declarative. I would say in the popular world, the most popular argument around that, or religious debate right now, is REST versus GraphQL. So REST tends to be very imperative, and GraphQL tends to be very declarative.
That's a really good article. Kim, just before you move on to that theme, though, for people who are a little newer to this, I just wanted to give an example. So in those two you just mentioned, like the imperative I control REST interface versus the declarative. Think of it as the imperative REST API, I'm touching this setting and then this setting and then this setting, and I am owning the right order that I want them done. And if one fails, I am owning going back and undoing those changes afterwards. Whereas when I'm coming in this JSON document with all of the information, think of that as the single interaction, where I'm saying it's effectively a JSON representation of a configuration file.
Yep.
This is the configuration, and here I'm giving it to you, and you're just going to say that configuration worked or not. So it's just that step up in abstraction. Is that a good summary of kind of what
that's perfect? Very concise.
But GraphQL, I forgot about stuff.
I wasn't going to go down the GraphQL rabbit hole, to be honest, but it's the most well-known imperative v declarative kind of conversation I think going on right now. And we had a conversation before we jumped on about, this being a very timeless kind of topic. I've heard it come up many times over the years, but I would say GraphQL represents the current kind of big one going on. But for me, the argument isn't imperative versus declarative. it's imperative and declarative. You know, me as API architect, API evangelist, I'm building an interface for a wide audience. That's my whole purpose, is this is why I use HTTP and web APIs, is that it reaches a wide audience. So that's my objective, and I want to reach the people who want declarative as well as the people who want imperative. I don't see it as a versus.
Okay, and on that thing, so that's interesting. I mean, yeah, people. I think a lot of people who are trying to push the simplicity of adopting their technology want to talk only about declarative, because the interaction is greatly simplified. You just have to learn that JSON representation of a configuration file and say, here you go, have a nice day. But there are many things where you need to, for example, if I'm doing a read of something and I want to use that information to impact the decision elsewhere on another technology, well, that may have been abstracted in my declarative interface. Therefore, I need to talk to an imperative interface to get that data and feed that off to something else. So once we get into the world of systems thinking, and maybe let's say I'm a customer and I'm not vendor side. So to me, my declarative service representation is of my system and not of individual devices. So to me, what that vendor's calling declarative is actually very imperative, because I don't see any of those settings anywhere else.
Yes. And this is the, if you've ever seen Men in Black, the movie, you know, the world living in the locker at the bus station, you know, that's their world. They worship this little altar, and they have no idea they live in this wider world. Not that developers are always like, you know, that closed off, but we live in our little worlds, and you may think you're declarative and you have the knowledge, but you're just on a device rather than at the next level. And then at the global, you know, level could outpace, and, you know, so there could be many levels of what defines bounded contexts, I guess, that define what is imperative and what is declarative. And I think really for me, the moral of the story is developers need to, you know, make sure they're not totally locked into their little imperative view of the world and tuning out the rest of the world, because they need to think about, you know, how to help onboard new people. Maybe, you know, there's a bigger world than them they need to consider. So that's the challenge I find with developers, is people who usually screaming for a declarative. I'm happy to give it to them if there's a need, but they need to understand that, you know, not everyone knows or sees a system like they do, and there's probably some other people that we should be considering. So,
I mean, I guess a good question to ask people when they're getting a little too obsessive over declarative is, like, what do they think's underneath that declarative interface?
That's the other thing, is there's kind of a I don't know, a rabbit hole kind of aspect to it. Is yeah, somewhere someone's still got to process that big JSON blob and parse it up and apply it incrementally and get those details back. That know when you know, add a pool, that when you're adding pool members, you have to have that ID. So that pool does have to be added first. And so whether you're offloading that work to someone else, a system, or you're doing it yourself, you know, that's important questions to ask. And I actually see it's imperative and declarative and orchestration, because declarative to me is being able to orchestrate with the imperative. So I could take that big JSON object and just orchestrate it into 55 separate imperative REST API calls and have it execute, get the status code back. And so that's an orchestration, or kind of workflow system, choreography, some people call it, but being able to choreograph with many imperative APIs to achieve the same goals as a declarative system. So it depends on where you want to offload that, or how you want to think about it, I guess.
That's, I really like that example. I mean, I guess the important thing to keep thinking about and reminding yourself about when implementing these systems is that also there are many different orchestration tools, and under those orchestration tools are segments of automation that are going on to feed the orchestration machine, the bigger picture. And you see a lot, if you read all the marketing, it's like, oh, that orchestration tool's winning the fight, we're going to go all in with them. But the reality is, no, actually, that's not how it goes, because this one's better at like infrastructure automation, but it's terrible for managing builds and integrating in with my Jira, and that's going to be a different tool there, and there's a handoff from that tool to the next tool, and it is far more complex than starting greenfield and saying, I'm going all in with Ansible.
Yeah.
Not realistic. It doesn't really work that way. Is that kind of, you've done a lot of consulting before you came in, before you joined F5. Is that sort of how you've seen the world?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, it's, you know, especially in a multi-cloud world, when you're thinking, oh, I need to scale this across Amazon and Azure, or Amazon and Google, or my own data center. So how do you think about those types of orchestration tools? But, you know, for me, I mean, you want to try to, you know, help people with declarative interfaces and be as successful and in reducing the friction, the number of steps they need to do. But someone's got to go through and define what all those steps are and what those differences are. You know, we may have the same 15 steps, but doing it on Amazon versus doing Azure, what does that look like? And you may be using containers and Kubernetes, but you know, they still have different kind of nuances to how they do business. So someone's got to flesh out each of those steps and kind of normalize those. And that usually takes a human, you know, and then, you know, for you developers who want a declarative, you know, that human hopefully can share that and make a declarative that takes action on those steps. So.
And I think, speaking a little more to the technical side and the interaction with declarative, because if you, there's plenty you can read out there about the actual architectural side of what that interface kind of looks like and its design, etc. But I think the bit that maybe isn't talked about enough is the behavioral side of declarative versus imperative. When I'm doing single kind of turn that feature on or enable this, and all I have to do is get back an immediate response, that's fine. But when I switch to something like declarative, it's entirely possible that now I'm going to be introduced to new concepts like that's going to be transactional.
Yeah.
So I'm giving you a job ID, and actually your system now has to pull the job ID to work out when that's done. If you look at, if anyone's done any work with like Amazon's API, even if it's a task that's going to immediately complete, you still get that job ID. And it's like, you ask me when it's done. It is done, but you still are going to ask me anyway. So they've gone all in on that model where it's like, you know, it's all going to be this way. So yeah, I think that's a bit that throws a lot of people off, because if you're doing automation and it's very much kind of scripted, like run this, then run this, then run this, there are certain languages and frameworks out there that don't understand how to do polling. Yeah. So suddenly everything breaks because, well, you shouldn't be running the 5th command until the 3rd is fully completed, because there are certain things that my orchestration expects to be running and expects to be fine. So if I'm just doing something like very simple, I'm right now struggling for an example, obviously, but if I don't have some kind of sleep or while loop in there that looks for that 200 OK, or that can keep polling to get the response back from that task before we complete, I'm gonna break everything. And a lot of early automation, kind of when people start looking at, there is an assumption that each thing is just gonna work, and it's really hard to get that rollback. What if I get to step 5, then 4 reports back that it's broken? Well, suddenly my script, which I thought would be 5 curl commands, has turned into 300 lines of code, because now I need to go, okay, well, if step 5 does break, I have to undo 4, 3, 2, and 1 to a state that is okay again without breaking anything else.
Yeah, yeah. Or if you want to inject 5 new steps into there, you know, once it's declarative, I would say it's a little more strict, where, you know, orchestration across imperative, you can add those 5 steps, you can put in those pauses, look for those status codes. I feel like you have a lot more control, but yes, you end up having a lot more work, I guess. And it just depends on how a developer's can, you know, see how it works. So.
Yeah, totally. And I bring that up because it's great if vendors are creating declarative interfaces, but when you're stringing together an orchestration and you're presenting a declarative interface up, you own that responsibility of if device 3 in my chain breaks, I've got to roll back 2 and 1.
Yeah.
To the known good state of before. And then we had a mutual friend, new friend to me, but old friend to you, Abanov, on last week, the CEO and founder of Postman, because I was talking with him about how it's great to be able to create a Postman workflow to just get someone used to, this is how you talk to it with the API.
Yeah.
And once you're familiar with that and you know how to support that, well, that next big step is, well, now I'm using this Postman collection that talks to device technology A, and this one talks to that firewall, and that can talk to a router. Now I got to work out how to make them string together, and where 3 can't run till 2's done, and it's got to check that rule's operational before 5's done. And that's the difference between automation and orchestration in my mind. Automation is just very single-serving device-oriented. Orchestration is handling that series, that ordering in, well, we're not even talking about imperative or declarative anymore, but I think these are really important things.
No, I think we hit on an important one. I think bringing Postman into it is an important way of reducing friction for imperative interfaces, that you can still, through a collection and what these orchestrations, achieve that imperative or declarative, excuse me, feel, because you're structuring all these calls, you're daisy chaining it all together, and then you can save that as a collection and give that to one of your juniors or something and say, here, execute this, or here's what I mean, you know. And for me, in that orchestrative imperative world, that there's a lot more serendipity, there's a lot more creativity, innovation, because you can, you know, oh, I have these 30 APIs, I can do this. Oh, I'm actually going to do something different by injecting a Twilio API call to, you know, do something different or send an SMS as part of this. So you're able to get creative with what you do with APIs rather than just a declarative, you know, blob that you're throwing at something. And I think Postman's an important tool, because there's a lot of APIs that I use Postman for that'll never have a GUI, never have an interface. I really don't build it into applications, but it's kind of a utility one. And I have a Postman collection for that, and I'll use that as part of orchestrations. And so it's an important client tooling, I think, in leveling this imperative versus declarative argument. So I think that actually makes sense.
That's cool, man. And that is a great way of also building out not just your collection of implementing, but building out your collection of what to do when you do something that's known bad. So when you're out there working out how to onboard a new technology into your orchestration tool chain, and you're looking at that and you build the collection, it's like, great, and that vendor was good to me, they provided a declarative interface, so my collection's quite short, I just have to give it this information. But the next thing you should do is the what if something that goes wrong collection for that same tool. There should always be both, not just how do I deploy, but put an error in that collection and then manage the handout. So first one should be the known good working, but the second one should be the I'm injecting an error and I'm testing that my rollback works. And once you've got those two, then you're kind of ready to start integrating into higher order systems. But if you can't handle the latter, your script only works when the wind's blowing the right way and the sun's at the perfect altitude, and that's not an environment I kind of want to work in.
Well, the daisy chain and orchestrate with all 3 of our episodes here. So the first one was design first. So if you're not laying out those assertions, those business assertions, right or wrong, as part of that design process, and then mocking and designing your APIs against those business assertions, you're not going to achieve the API contract level of doing business with people, because you're not exploring what those things going wrong, you know. And so if you're not testing for those, oh, I'm 15 steps into this, and then the 5th one, you know, gives me a 500, and have to be forced to think about, well, what do I do now? Is this hard? I have to roll everything back. I have to, you know, change the state back, or can I just wait, do it again, try again, retry, and then move forward again, you know? So you have to think through those things, and it's an important part of the process.
Good link back to the other episodes, Kim.
Yeah.
Episodes 43 and 40. Well, so on the contract thing, I mean, any vendor who's giving you an API to use should be providing some kind of API contract to you. This is how we error. This is the error you get. You can rely on that error. You will always get that error. For example, or this is what happens if you overflow it. It's going to queue up to 10 and drop the 11th. Like that just, every vendor who's an API has a responsibility of providing that to their customers so that they can architect around those behaviors. But if you're an engineer building an architecture and you have many devices and services and software with APIs. Your job, I guess, is to create a your environment specific version of that contract over the top. So I've been told by that vendor it's going to do X when I do Y to it.
Mm-hmm.
I need to say, in our environment, what is the consequence of that and how are we going to behave around it?
Mm-hmm.
Because really, if you think about it, that is just that vendor's API in their contract. That is just a window you're looking into their device. That has no responsibility of what that's going to do to your system and your environment. Mm-hmm. So you kind of need to have your own, like, okay, well, if it does give me one of these 500s, our response to that is X, is trigger this workflow or back this out or send a Slack message or Twilio or whatever it might be. And I think, yeah, API contracts, it's not just about beating up your vendors to provide one. I think it's also about extending API contracts with your own internal expectations and behaviors around them as well.
Well, and having the experience in doing business with many different partners and providers, to have the wisdom to know when contract language is missing from a provider, that if they don't share, acknowledge that, if they only say in their Swagger Open API, all we have is a 200 response. We all know that's BS. We all know your API contract at some point is going to give me a 404 or give me a 500. So you're just not being honest in your contractual language. And then it's up to me, do I want to use this vendor because they're omitting certain behaviors that can happen? Or do I just make sure that we have a standard approach for how we manage partners like this, acknowledging that these contracts are somewhat incomplete, and augment that on our side, on like the client side contract, like you said, and build that in, that resiliency into our systems.
Yeah, totally. And with those, with that in place, with your vendor side kind of API contracts, and then your expectations of what you provide to your business above, that's that design part of the API first strategy. If I've got that worked out, like I know they'll do this when I type Dr. Zeus instead of like a real URI on the end, it's going to buff X. I can say that I do that in this way. Then design contracts. Well, actually, now we're getting into the details of like imperative versus declarative. That's actually less scary because graceful failure is perfectly okay. It's the unanticipated failure that makes things really fall apart. Give me 404s all day long when I make mistakes because I can code around a 404. But me having no idea whether it might be a 404 this time, or you could just have had a lazy coder spew out a 500 when he didn't know what to give.
Yeah.
Now I've got to start writing code that's got to work out. Well, intermittently their product does X instead of Y. Then I'm going to have a very negative opinion.
Yeah, our mutual friend Scott Peters from F5, he came up the other day with a kind of the low bar for what you just described, and it's the poop emoji. So if he can submit with Postman the poop emoji to your API and it blows, then there's a problem. So
I love that. And huge shout out to Scott Peters if you're listening. Big fan of your work, and I love that he's running with that because we've had that chat as well. He was telling me about his poop emoji idea, and I think it's genius. Maybe an ASCII representation of that somehow. It's got to happen.
Yeah. You wanna name your network or your pool poop emoji? Go ahead, try it. We're gonna make sure our system handles it well.
Fantastic. That's a good test that you haven't hard coded any bad behaviors in there. Well, what a topic to end on, poop emojis. I hope this has been a useful one to our listeners. I guess the key theme for me, takeaway for me, is just that there's multiple different levels. It's really easy to get the kind of blinkers on and just see one kind of element of imperative versus declarative. But you know what? When you're building a system, everything's imperative and declarative. And actually, definitely go back and watch the kind of API first strategy and API contracts episodes if you are watching this one, because there's a lot of steps you can take beforehand that makes this a lot less scary. I mean, I think some of the things we talk about on here can be quite scary, and really they're not if you take some of these other steps beforehand. So Yeah, I mean, huge thanks again, Ken, for coming on. Really love our conversations. Really great stuff.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to coming back. I feel, like I said, a regular. So I look forward to next time.
Awesome, buddy. And if any listeners want a specific topic for us to talk about, by all means, reach out. There's a lot of things to talk about in the API world, so I don't see us running out anytime soon. But yeah, if there's any topics that people are interested in, reach out. You can go to REDtalks.live / I think it's contacts. There's a link for a contact form. So yeah, hit us up on there. So anyway, another great episode. This has been Nathan Pierce, your host of REDtalks.live, your home of ranting engineers and DevOps. Thanks for listening.